Welcome to Whispered Clues. Tonight, we follow Sherlock Holmes into the shadow in the bell tower, where silence hides what the bells refuse to tell. Where in the world are you joining us from? Now, pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. It was not the chime itself that startled me, but the hesitation before it. A pause so thin it might have been a held breath between the city's heartbeats. And yet it carried the unease of something watching. Holmes looked up from the armchair opposite, his hand frozen above the violin's bridge, bow suspended mid-air as though it too waited for permission to continue. Another toll followed deeper, slower, and touched by distortion, as if the bell's iron throat had cracked. He murmured, half to himself, that St. Alban's bell had not sounded at this hour for 70 years. I reminded him, perhaps unwisely, that clocks could err. He replied that time might err, but bells do not without human cause. The remark hung between us with the smoke. The letter arrived before the last vibration died. A small envelope, thick cream, edges faintly singed as if drawn too near a candle. It bore no address beyond Baker Street, and though the postmark was smudged, I thought I saw the impression of a cross. Holmes unfolded it, laid it flat, and read aloud in a tone almost courteous. The bell tolls where faith once faltered. Midnight will strike upon absence. I asked if it was a joke. He said jesting required laughter. The handwriting, though disguised, had the faint backward lean of a man accustomed to accounting. His eyes drifted toward the map pinned to the wall, the quarter around Smithfield marked with crimson ink. He tapped at the circle beside the church of St. Albans. The bell tower, he said quietly, had been sealed since 1854. Sealed and left unentered. He rose then, swift but graceful, and fetched his overcoat. The violin was still quivering from that aborted note. He plucked the string once, softly, and the sound seemed to merge with the dying echo of the bell outside. He said that the tone was identical to a D-sharp, slightly flat from corrosion. I found myself glancing toward the window, though the fog rendered the city into pale uncertainty. The same sound returned again, faint, then again, as if the distance between Baker Street and Smithfield had collapsed into one vibrating thread. Holmes spoke briskly. The note was not written today. The soot along its edge was old. Whoever sent it had kept it for years, waiting for tonight's bell to resume. He asked for his gloves, and as I handed them, he observed a small flake of rust upon my sleeve. I protested ignorance, but he only smiled a brief flicker of amusement that never reached his eyes, and said that it told him I'd brushed against a wrought iron railing damp from recent rain. The rain, he noted, had ceased an hour ago in Marylebone, but not yet in Clerkenwell. Therefore, our correspondent awaited us there. We left the rooms without another word. The sound followed us down the stairwell, not the bell now, but the faint rhythm of our own steps aligning with its pulse. Outside, the lamps burned low, and the air carried a metallic dampness like old coins. A constable turned as we passed, recognized Holmes, and nodded in silent respect. Holmes's pace was deliberate. He walked as though measuring the city by its silences rather than its streets. When we reached the junction near Holborn Viaduct, he stopped. The bell gave another uncertain tremor, softer, as if smothered by distance or fog. He said that each toll was weaker than the last, as though the instrument itself were dying. Then he added, not to me, but to the darkness before him, that something or someone must be helping it die. We entered the narrow lane leading toward St. Albans. No sound now, only the wet sigh of the gaslight. Holmes's hand brushed the rough stone wall. He paused and ran his fingers over a line of indentations near shoulder height. Marks of a ladder recently removed, he said. The mortar still crumbled under his nail, damp and fresh. He motioned me to stillness, then listened. A single droplet fell from the tower above, striking a sheet of tin. Then, faintly, a whisper, not voice, not wind, more like the continuation of that very first hesitation before the bell. Holmes stepped forward. The church door stood ajar, though chained. Within, something moved a flutter, a metallic scrape, and then a sound like breath expelled against stone. I reached for my revolver. Holmes shook his head. He bent, examined the lock, and touched the chain. "Warm," he said. "Recently handled." The bell gave one last toll brief, incomplete, as if strangled mid-air. Holmes looked up toward the unseen belfry. "Now we begin," he murmured. Holmes moved first, slipping through the narrow opening with a precision that turned hesitation into purpose. I followed, keeping one hand upon the cold stone. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lime and damp parchment. The nave stood in ruinous silence. Dust hung like smoke in the faint glow of our lantern. The bell rope, frayed and cut, dangled above the chancel arch, its lower end still swinging from our entrance draught. Holmes lifted the lantern, the yellow circle drifting across pews slick with condensation. He said softly that a bell so long sealed could not ring by itself. Someone had entered from within. I asked if he suspected the caretaker. He replied that the church had none since the diocese sold the land. Then he touched the floor beneath the first pew with a small indentation, boot-shaped, filled with fresh water. He said the man who left it was not a vagrant, but a tradesman, narrow sole, slight arch, heel worn to the left. A cobbler's gait, perhaps, or an engraver's. Someone accustomed to leaning forward for delicate work. The bell rope stirred again, faintly. Holmes raised his head. The sound came not from above, but from the vestry door beyond the pulpit, a subtle metallic rasp, like wire brushing wood. He stepped toward it, motioning me to dim the light. I did so, heart hammering in time with that dying echo. Then a voice, hoarse, muffled and trembling, slipped through the crack of the door. "Is it midnight? Has it struck?" Holmes answered without pause. "It has begun to strike, but not yet finished." There was silence. Then the voice whispered, "Then he is not free." Something shifted, a body perhaps, and the chain clattered inside. Holmes turned to me, eyes bright. The phrasing, he said, was ecclesiastical, not free, meaning not absolved. The man behind the door believed himself in ritual, not crime. He pushed gently, and the door gave way. The figure crouched beside a chest, lantern snuffed out, hands dark with soot. He was thin, middle-aged, with an apron stiff from age and ink. Upon the chest lay fragments of bronze and rope, a small hammer, and a set of tuning forks. The man blinked against the light, murmuring that he was late. Holmes knelt beside him and examined the tools. Bell foundry instruments, he said, the kind used to restore tone to cracked metal. The man nodded as if in confession. He had come, he said, to heal the bell. His master's last wish demanded it. Holmes asked the name of the master. The man hesitated, eyes flicking toward the belfry steps. Then he whispered, "Father Merrick of St. Albans." Holmes stilled. I recalled the name dimly from parish records of a priest convicted of theft from the cathedral fund, long dead. The man insisted that Merrick had been wronged, that the bell's silence was part of the curse laid upon him. Tonight, at the same hour, Merrick died. The bell had called to be mended. Holmes examined the hammer. The metal head bore a faint reddish dust. He tapped it once against the chest. The sound was dull, imperfect. Then he said quietly that no man mending a bell would carry such corrosion unless he had been striking something other than bronze. He handed the hammer to me, and I saw a dark crust along the edge. It was blood. The foundryman's breath caught. He swore he had only defended himself. Holmes asked from whom. The man looked toward the belfry again. "From the one who waited there," he said. "He said he came from the diocese to see the work, but his papers bore the same mark as the letter you hold." His finger trembled toward Holmes's pocket. Holmes drew out the envelope, the smudged cross faint under the lamplight. The foundryman gasped as though seeing judgment itself. Holmes questioned him swiftly, his voice now the steady rhythm of inquiry. When had the visitor arrived? At the first toll. What words had he spoken? Only that the bell must ring once before dawn, or the truth would never rest. The foundryman had ascended the tower to inspect the crack. When he descended again, the man lay motionless by the door. He fled, fearing accusation, and hid in the vestry until we entered. Holmes stood, gaze fixed upon the stairway. He said that the sound we had heard earlier about the uneven toll could not have been the bell alone. Its mechanism required two men, one to hold the counterweight, one to release the rope. Therefore, if the foundryman had been above, someone else had been with him. Dead men do not ring bells. He crossed to the steps. The air there felt colder, as though each turn of the spiral drew us backward in time. Halfway up, we found a trail of bronze dust upon the stone, then a smudge of something darker. Holmes touched it, examined his fingertip, and whispered that it was neither rust nor blood, but soot mixed with oil, the residue of machinery recently forced. Someone had unsealed the gear that locked the bell wheel. He said the motion was deliberate, not vandalism or restoration, perhaps, but also a signal. We reached the landing. The bell loomed above, vast and black, its surface veined with cracks like frozen lightning. Beneath it lay a man in clerical garb, face turned upward as though awaiting absolution. His neck bore the mark of a chain. Holmes bent low, then drew from the man's pocket a small wooden crucifix wrapped in parchment. The parchment bore one phrase in fading ink: "When the bell breaks, the truth will ring." Holmes's voice lowered. This, he said, was no priest but an actor. The makeup upon his throat betrayed stagecraft. Someone had staged both ritual and death. I asked why. He answered that the true performance had yet to begin, and somewhere below, the foundryman screamed. Holmes turned at once, the lantern flaring in his grip. The cry was brief, cut short by the sound of metal slamming shut. From beneath us came the echo of the bell once more not rung, but struck as though by an unseen hand testing its tone. Holmes listened intently, his expression unreadable. He said the pitch had changed. Then, very quietly, he added that the dead bell was now answering to a living one. The dead bell was answering to a living one, that Holmes had said, and his words seemed to cling to the air even after the sound itself had faded. He dropped to one knee beside the foundryman, whose trembling hand still gripped the edge of the chest. Holmes spoke with quiet urgency. "You cried out because you heard it again. Tell me, was the tone above or below us?" The man shook his head helplessly. "I don't know, sir. It came from inside the wall like a breath under the stone." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Then whoever struck that tone is not in the tower, but within the church itself." He moved swiftly to the vestry door, pressed his ear to the wood, and then struck it once with his fingertips. The hollow echo returned uneven, metallic, alive. "There's a chamber behind this panel," he murmured. "And our unseen bell ringer resides there. I asked how that could be when the church had no crypt." "It has one now," Holmes replied grimly, "fashioned perhaps for a darker liturgy." With a swift motion, he produced his knife and slid it along the seam of the doorframe. A latch released. The dust wall pivoted inward with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The smell that met us was of damp iron and spent oil. Holmes turned to me. "Our intruder's sanctuary. Watson, bring the lantern." We descended. The stair curved in tight circles, the air growing thicker with every step. The sound motif returned the faint double toll that had haunted the night, but now it came from below, resonant and steady as a heartbeat. Holmes whispered that the pulse was mechanical. "It is not a bell, but an imitation, perhaps a device to maintain illusion." The man above wanted the city to hear faith restored. The man below wanted something else entirely. At the foot of the stair we entered a small chamber lined with brick and plaster. In its center stood a strange contrivance of metal rods and copper wires wound about a wooden core. A crank protruded from one side, and upon it was fixed a small mallet tipped with iron. Every few seconds the mallet struck a plate, producing that hollow, wounded toll that had deceived the city. Holmes bent to examine it. "A simulacrum of the sacred," he said, "and far more precise than any bell." He moved his hand over the mechanism. "It's running on stored power, a spring release, perhaps, or pressure from the tower's weight." He paused, listening. "But someone has set it deliberately. Look at these marks on the wall footprints. Fresh ones. He was here moments ago." Before I could answer, the chamber door swung shut behind us. We turned sharply. A figure stood in the stairway, lantern in hand. His coat was long and dust-streaked, his face narrow, his eyes too calm. Holmes's voice was low but steady. "You are the custodian of this echo, I presume?" The man inclined his head. "I am its keeper, and you, Mr. Holmes, have come to silence it." Holmes did not deny it. Truth seldom requires amplification. The man's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Truth requires memory. The bell remembers what men forget. He stepped into the light. His right ear bore a peculiar brass device, a hearing instrument, curved like a shell. Holmes noted it at once. "So you listen to the bell's heart. You hear what no other can." The man's voice was almost reverent. "I was the bell founder's apprentice. I gave it a voice, and when the church sealed it, I remained to hear it die." Holmes straightened. "And tonight you helped it speak again." The man's expression hardened. "It spoke for itself. I merely gave it air." He touched the copper coil. The tone deepened, pulsing through the chamber walls. "Every time they silenced it, I rebuilt it. Every century they forge faith anew upon deceit." The bell remembers. Holmes's reply was quiet, but cutting. "You mistake obsession for justice. This is no resurrection, only a repetition of guilt." The man's eyes glinted. "And yet you came when it called." Holmes's tone did not change. "Because the living are responsible for the dead's noise." He stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Come, with us. The mechanism will stop when you do." The man's answer was to strike the plate again. The echo leapt upward, shaking dust from the ceiling. "If you silence me, the city will forget what it did to Merrick. I've engraved his confession into every vibration. Even now, the bell carries his absolution across London." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Your bell carries only madness. You have turned faith into frequency." I saw his hand move toward the machine's crank. Holmes reached it first, twisting sharply. The plate gave a final clang, then snapped off its hinge. The vibration stopped. The sudden absence of sound was like a vacuum. The man cried out and rushed forward. Holmes caught his wrist. "Enough," he said. "Your work has ended. What remains is the truth without echo." The man sagged, breathing heavily. "Then hear the truth, detective." He raised his free hand to his ear, tore off the brass device, and thrust it toward Holmes. "This is what I hear. The bell does not toll alone. It carries voices, each calling the same name. Yours." Holmes froze, staring at the object. The copper shell emitted a faint vibration even in his palm. "A resonator tuned to my frequency," he said softly. "He built it to draw me here." I realized then the scale of the letters, the bell, the mechanism, all part of a design to summon Holmes himself. The man smiled faintly, blood at the corner of his mouth. "The bell finds its listener. Always." Holmes turned toward me, his face pale but composed. "Watson, the tone was never meant for London. It was meant for me." He crushed the resonator beneath his heel. The sound that escaped was neither metallic nor human, just a whisper, like breath drawn through dust. The man collapsed to his knees, hands clasped as though in prayer. Holmes looked down at him, then said quietly, And now, sir, the city may rest." For a moment, nothing stirred. Then from above, faint and deliberate, came another 2 beats, perfectly measured. Holmes's gaze lifted. "Not his doing," he whispered. "Something else has taken up the rhythm." He seized the lantern and motioned me toward the stair. "Quickly, Watson, before the echo becomes command." Holmes sprang down the stairway, his coat sweeping the wall as he descended 3 steps at a time. The lantern swung wildly, throwing erratic shadows that chased us through the spiral. The sound that met us below was neither human nor entirely mechanical, a clanging rhythmic pulse that merged the bell's metallic cry with something breathing beneath it. The foundryman's scream had ended, but a rasping moan now filled the nave, broken by short, staccato bursts of coughing. Holmes found him near the vestry door, doubled over beside the chest. The chain that had hung across the entrance now wrapped his wrist. His eyes were wide but conscious, and when Holmes freed him, he stammered that the man in the clerical coat had moved. Holmes said nothing, only checked the man's pulse, then turned his gaze upward as if following the sound through the stone itself. The bell's resonance had changed again, lower now, more deliberate. Each vibration seemed to touch the very air around us, a deep hum that grew and then stopped abruptly. I asked if he believed someone else was in the tower. He answered that there were always 2 forces in motion, the one that makes the sound and the one that stops it. He crossed to the wall behind the altar and ran his fingers along the masonry. Then, finding a faint seam, he pressed hard. The wall yielded slightly, and a thin draught exhaled from within, carrying a smell of soot and oil. Holmes said that the church had been altered after its closure. Its foundations were hollowed for storage, perhaps smuggling, perhaps worse. He handed me the lantern. We would follow the breath of that draught. The foundryman refused to be left behind. Holmes permitted him, but with a glance that warned silence. The passage opened low, forcing us to stoop. The bell's echo followed like a pulse behind our ears, recurring every few steps, fainter yet perfectly timed with our movement. After perhaps 20 yards, the passage widened into a chamber lined with crates and rotting hymnals. On the far wall stood a small iron door bolted from our side. Holmes brushed the metal, and the dust fell away to reveal an inscription cut crudely into the surface, "Liberamus eum insonitu." He translated softly. "We free him by sound." He said that the phrase revealed motive, not madness. Whoever orchestrated this affair sought to release not a ghost, but a secret. He motioned for the lantern. The light caught a series of small holes drilled into the wall behind the crates narrow enough for wire. Holmes knelt, tracing one to the floor. It vanished beneath the flagstones, reappearing near the door's hinge, then rising through the ceiling above us. He murmured that the wires would lead to the belfry's mechanism. The bell had been electrified not to ring, but to communicate. Someone had converted the ancient tower into a conductor of coded sound. I could not restrain my astonishment. Holmes smiled faintly. It was, he said, a marvel of obsession rather than science. The pattern of tolls would form words to those who knew their key. The message we had heard earlier about irregular pauses might have been a signal, not an error. Before I could reply, the foundryman seized Holmes's arm and pointed to the floor. A pool of moisture spread outward, black against the lantern's light. Holmes touched it, then lifted his finger to his nose. Not water. Ink, fresh and viscous. It had seeped through the cracks from below. He whispered that we were standing above a printing press. He unbolted the small door and pulled it open. A staircase descended into a dim glow. The sound motif changed again, now a slow, rhythmic tapping that echoed the bell's earlier pattern. Holmes said quietly, "The bell tolls above for the city, the press below prints its echo for the few." We descended. The cellar was narrow, filled with racks of paper and lead type. At its center stood a mechanical press, recently operated. The plates still gleamed wet with ink. Holmes lifted one and read "Truth Redeemed," the confession of Father Merrick. Beneath it, smaller text to be published at midnight. The foundryman stared, uncomprehending. Holmes said this was the true resurrection, not of a man, but of his reputation. Someone had revived Merrick's scandal to print a false confession clearing his name. The bell was their summons, the newspaper, their altar. A faint creak interrupted him. Footsteps descended from the passage we had come through, soft, deliberate, each step synchronized with the fading hum above. Holmes extinguished the lantern. The glow from the press cast a dull red sheen through the chamber. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a small case of wires. Holmes waited until the man stepped fully inside. Then he spoke from the darkness. "You are late for your midnight edition." The intruder froze. His outline betrayed the lean posture of a clerk, the cuffs of a journalist's coat. Holmes stepped into the light, his tone even. The man was known to him. Mr. Leighton, editor of the Morning Herald, was dismissed 2 years ago for forging letters to the diocese. Leighton's face twitched between fear and indignation. He declared that Merrick had been innocent, that the church had buried the truth, and that he had restored both man and faith through print. Holmes replied that a man cannot restore faith by counterfeiting evidence. Leighton insisted the bell had spoken to him, that each toll marked approval from above. Holmes pointed to the case in his hand, a battery and relay device, and said it was his own hand that had made the bell speak. Leighton stepped backward, shouting that he was freeing a soul. Holmes answered that he was merely replacing one falsehood with another. At that moment, the foundryman stumbled against the press, and its rollers turned once. The bell above answered with a faint tremor. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The mechanism was still linked. One more surge could send current to the tower and ring the bell again. Leighton saw it too and lunged for the switch. Holmes caught his wrist. They struggled, the sound of metal scraping underfoot mingling with their breath. Then the press jolted and the bell roared above, shaking dust from the beams. The vibration grew until it seemed the church itself was breathing through the walls. Holmes forced the switch open. The bell's cry collapsed into a dying murmur. Leighton fell to his knees, muttering that the message had failed. Holmes said softly that truth need not be printed to be heard. The silence that followed was vast. Then, from somewhere above, a faint answering tone, clear, single, unbidden, rang once and faded into the stone. Holmes remained motionless as the last note dissolved into the walls, his head tilted slightly as though he were listening to the dying breath of reason itself. The bell's echo lingered in my bones, not as sound, but as vibration. Leighton sat upon the floor, his chest heaving. His eyes darted toward the press as if the machine might speak again in his defense. The foundryman crouched beside him, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Holmes finally turned, the sharpness of his expression softened by something almost akin to pity. He said that no ghost had spoken, only a man who mistook his own guilt for revelation. Leighton's mouth opened to argue, but Holmes silenced him with a raised hand. "You heard what you wished to hear," he said quietly. "The bell did not answer your conscience. It merely repeated your deceit in another key." Leighton struggled upright, defiant even in disgrace. He claimed that the forged confession would restore a name unjustly ruined. Holmes replied that redemption built on forgery was no absolution at all. Then, more softly, he asked who had written the words upon the parchment found in the dead man's pocket. "When the bell breaks, the truth will ring." Leighton hesitated. He said that phrase had come from Merrick himself, copied from the priest's sermon notes preserved in diocesan records. Holmes's eyes brightened. "Have you seen those records personally?" Leighton nodded. "And where were they housed?" Leighton faltered. "In the crypt below St. Albans." Holmes took a step closer. "Then tell me," he said. "Why the diocesan registry, which was moved to Westminster 5 years ago, still keeps its ghost here beneath a condemned church." Leighton paled. The foundryman crossed himself. Holmes continued, voice tightening, "Because you placed them here. You, or the one who paid you, built this stage for your miracle." Leighton's composure broke. He whispered that he had acted on commission from a patron who claimed descent from Merrick's family. The money arrived through intermediaries. The instructions were delivered by letter, always marked with the same symbol that had sealed the envelope we received. Holmes drew the letter again, its smudged cross now damp from his fingers. He held it beneath the lantern's glow. The ink had bled enough to reveal a faint shape around the cross, not a religious emblem, but the outline of a key. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The mark of the Guild of St. Crispin," he said. "The old brotherhood of engravers and cobblers dissolved 30 years ago." The foundryman gasped. He confessed that his own father had once belonged to that guild, before it was broken up for smuggling relics and falsifying seals. Leighton shook his head in disbelief. Holmes pressed on. "Your patron, then, was not a priestly heir, but an heir to forgery itself." He gestured toward the broken rope above. "The bell you tried to sanctify was once cast for that guild's hall before being given to the church. Every strike of it carried their mark." Leighton whispered that he had not known. Holmes's tone softened. "Few conspirators know the full chord they play. You struck one note of a darker harmony." Then, turning to me, he said we must reach the crypt at once before the evidence vanished, and perhaps the true architect of this echo returned to silence it. He ordered Leighton to remain seated and handed his revolver to the foundryman. "If he moves, sound the alarm by any means," he said. The man nodded, still trembling, and Holmes and I mounted the narrow stair toward the altar once more. The vibration had subsided, but each footstep answered faintly from above, like a whisper tracing our ascent. When we reached the nave, the air seemed colder, emptied as though the church itself listened. Holmes went straight to the wall where he had earlier discovered the draught. He pressed again. This time the panel slid aside fully, revealing a stone stair leading downward. The sound returned, a dull, intermittent pulse, not from the bell now, but from beneath our feet. We descended in silence, the lantern's light glancing off water-streaked walls. The stair ended in a narrow archway, opening into a crypt lined with empty coffers. At its center stood a single iron chest bound by chains. Holmes knelt and examined the lock. A thin line of oil glistened along the seam. "Open recently," he murmured. He traced the chain to a bolt set into the wall, then smiled faintly, curious that they would lock a box but anchor it as well. Whatever was stored here was not merely precious, it was dangerous. He produced his penknife and worked the mechanism. The lock yielded with a sound that echoed far too loudly. Inside lay rolls of parchment sealed with crimson wax, each bearing the crest of the diocesan court, and beneath them a set of metal plates etched with elaborate lettering. Holmes lifted one and turned it toward the light. "The Confession of Father Merrick," he read aloud, by his own hand. But the etching beneath bore another line, faint and unfinished, engraved under the authority of the Guild of St. Crispin. He looked at me sharply. There was never a priestly confession. This was the Guild's work, an attempt to fabricate divine testimony for profit. He turned the plate again, and the faint reflection of the lantern trembled across its surface. "And yet," he added, "someone continued the task tonight." Before I could ask them, a soft click sounded from the stair behind us. Holmes extinguished the lantern with a swift motion. We froze. Footsteps descended slowly, deliberately, and accompanied by a faint metallic rattle, like a chain brushed by a ring. The figure halted at the archway, outlined faintly by the distant light above. Then came a whisper, low and deliberate. "The bell has spoken once more. You should not have answered." Holmes's hand brushed my arm, a signal to remain still. The figure stepped closer, and the dim glow revealed a gaunt face half hidden by the hood of a coat. His right hand carried a small coil of wire. Holmes said softly, "You have been below the tower before. You know how the sound travels." The man smiled faintly. "It travels well enough to cover another's death." He lifted the coil. The faint hum of current filled the air again, merging with the memory of the bell. Holmes tensed, ready to move. But the man pressed a switch, and the hum deepened into a resonant vibration that made the chains on the chest quiver. Holmes whispered, "He means to collapse the foundation." The man's smile widened, and the hum grew until dust rained from the ceiling above. The vibration intensified until the flagstones beneath our boots seemed to shiver. Holmes lunged forward, wrenching the wire from the stranger's hand. Sparks burst between them, brief and blue, and the hum cut off with a gasp from the man as though his own lungs had collapsed under the weight of silence. The chain binding the iron chest rattled once more, then fell still. For an instant, even the echoes held their breath. Holmes gripped the man's wrist, forcing him to the ground. The coil clattered away. I seized the lantern and reignited it, revealing a narrow, angular face streaked with grime. The man's expression was not madness, but exultation. He whispered that the foundations had listened and obeyed. Holmes demanded his name. He smiled faintly. It was once Merrick, too, though I have earned no saint's title. Then he coughed, the sound dry and broken like a bell with a cracked lip. Holmes bent close. "You are the descendant Leighton mentioned," he said, "the one who financed his forgeries." The man nodded weakly. "The church took everything from my bloodline. Tonight I restore its toll." He tried to laugh, but the sound faltered into wheezing. Holmes's eyes glimmered. "You mistake restoration for revenge. The bell you have awakened was forged for deception. It will not absolve you." The man's gaze shifted toward the chest. "You will never understand," he hissed. "It is not faith I restore, but legacy. Each sound carries memory. The metal remembers what it once declared." Holmes straightened. "And yet the truth of sound is in its silence," he said. "The moment it ceases, judgment begins." The man struggled, then reached for his pocket. Holmes caught the motion and withdrew a small, crude, battery-driven detonator, its wire already connected to the device he had dropped. Holmes traced it with quick fingers and found it led beneath the chest, disappearing into a narrow fissure. "You have laced the foundation with your own mechanism," he said. "You would bury your father's shame beneath the stones." The man's breathing grew shallow. Better buried than forgotten. Holmes snapped the wire free with a sharp twist. "And yet you forget, sir, that a lie cannot be entombed. It will echo, as your bell has echoed hollow and untrue." He dragged the man upright. I could see the pulse hammering at the man's temple. His voice came now in fragments, as if he fought against the rhythm of his own guilt. It was not murder, only justice. The bell called Holmes' tone sharpened. "Whose blood stains the hammer? Above, if not the innocents. You struck him, then set your counterfeit priest to watch while you fled. You waited for your device to finish what your conscience could not." The man's body trembled. "He betrayed the plan," he whispered. "He wished to tell the papers. I silenced him, but the bell betrayed me. It tolled before I could destroy the evidence." He broke into a fit of coughing. When it passed, Holmes asked one final question. The phrase, "When the bell breaks, truth will ring." "Did you know its meaning?" The man looked up, eyes glassy. "It was our code. When the bell breaks, the lie must die." Holmes released him and he slumped against the stone. The hum had faded completely. Only the faint drip of water punctuated the stillness. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, take the coil." We must disable whatever remains of his contraption before it reacts to the moisture. I crouched near the fissure, my fingers tracing the edge. The wire ran deeper than expected, snaking toward the north wall. Holmes followed it with his gaze, then whispered, "The old drainage tunnel. It must lead to the tower's base." He seized the lantern and moved swiftly along the wall, finding a hidden arch partly obscured by rubble. The air beyond was colder, threaded with that low metallic scent again. We stepped through. The passage sloped upward, narrowing as it climbed. Above, faint reverberations returned, the bell's tone distorted, not struck but vibrating from within as though answering some unseen pressure. Holmes stopped, eyes half closed. "Do you hear it, Watson?" The frequency has changed again. It's the pitch of hollow iron under strain the tower is preparing to yield. We emerged into the lower chamber of the belfry, the same one where we had first seen the dead actor. His body was gone. Holmes's expression hardened. "He has been removed. Our culprit is not the only one who knew of this night's design." He examined the floor where the man had lain and found a smear of soot leading toward a side stair. "Someone dragged him down," he said, perhaps to ensure no witness remained. The vibration grew deeper. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Holmes called to me to steady the lantern while he climbed the final ladder toward the bell itself. He examined the beam, ran his hand along the pulley, and stopped. "Here lies the heart of the deception." He pointed to a small metal disc affixed inside the bell's rim. A resonator tuned to the same electrical pattern as the coil below. Each pulse would cause the bell to vibrate imperceptibly until it appeared to toll of its own will. Ingenious, Watson, and diabolical. He removed the disc carefully and held it to the light. This alone would create the illusion of divine response. When Leighton and our foundryman heard the bell's uneven tone, they thought heaven had answered. In truth, it was this device, echoing the guilt of its maker. I asked if the tower was safe. Holmes gave a slight nod. For the moment. But if the current returns, the resonance could split the beam. He descended swiftly, the bell's silence following like a held breath. When his feet touched the stone, he spoke more softly. "The question that remains is who removed the body, and why." The man he had subdued stirred faintly. Holmes crouched beside him. "Answer me once more. Did anyone assist you tonight?" The man shook his head weakly. "No one, only the sound." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then whispered, "That may yet be true." He motioned me toward the stairs. "We must return to the foundryman and Mr. Leighton before this church buries all three of them." As we moved into the corridor, a faint breeze passed us from above, carrying with it a single note, high, brittle, and pure, as if the bell, though silent, had exhaled one last warning. Holmes halted midway down the passage, head turned toward the faint vibration that drifted from above like the dying breath of a struck glass. The tone lingered between air and imagination. He whispered that such resonance was not natural. I asked if it came from the bell itself. He shook his head. "No, Watson. That note was formed in the hollow of a throat, not in bronze." We quickened our pace, the narrow stair echoing underfoot. When we reached the vestry door once more, the air was thick with soot. The press stood idle, yet the smell of oil was stronger. Leighton was gone. Only the foundryman remained, slumped against the chest, clutching the revolver. He looked up at us in panic. He said he would finish it. He said the last toll must be his. Holmes's face sharpened. Which way did he go? The man pointed toward the nave, where the fog from the broken windows drifted like smoke through the pews. Holmes took the lantern and moved forward. The faint hum persisted, rising now and then to a whisper that seemed almost human, a breath catching on the edge of a word. He spoke softly, half to himself. He believes himself to be the bell's final voice. He means to strike the note that ends his own lie. The foundryman stumbled after us. "He took the tuning fork," he said. "The large one, the D sharp." Holmes stopped, eyes gleaming. "Then he intends to set the bell vibrating once more. The tone would match the first toll, but the frequency could shatter the beam. The tower will collapse." We ran. The sound grew louder as we neared the spiral stair, an unnatural thrumming that pressed against the eardrum. Holmes motioned for silence, then ascended carefully. Halfway up, he turned to me. "He will not hear us through the resonance. The tone creates a wall of its own." We emerged into the chamber. Leighton stood by the pulley, his hair disordered, his face lit by the small electric spark of the tuning fork striking metal. Each impact released a hum that merged with the tower's bones. Holmes called his name. Leighton turned, eyes wild. "You cannot stop it now," he cried. "The bell has learned to sing again." Holmes advanced slowly. "You mistake madness for music. That tone is not truth. It is decay." Leighton raised the fork again, his hand trembling. "Merrick's name will be cleared. The city will hear it ring and know the church lied." Holmes's reply was calm, almost sorrowful. "And when the tower falls, whose name will the stones clear first, his or yours?" Leighton hesitated, the rhythm faltering. Holmes seized the moment. "You told us Merrick's words were engraved from his sermons, yet you never asked why the phrase ends with silence. When the bell breaks, truth will ring." The break was literal. It meant confession only follows destruction. You were never chosen to deliver it, only to prove how falsehood reverberates. Leighton's expression wavered between comprehension and defiance. "Then let truth destroy us all," he said, and struck the fork once more. The bell above groaned, a long metallic wail that rolled through the rafters. The beam split with a crack. Holmes darted forward, wrenching the fork from Leighton's hand, but the vibration had already taken hold. Dust cascaded like snow. I shouted that the tower would not hold. Holmes dragged Leighton toward the stair. "Move! Watson to the nave." The foundryman followed, clutching the revolver uselessly. As we descended, each step seemed to beat time with a deepening roar overhead. The bell no longer told, it howled, its voice collapsing inward. At the base, Holmes shoved Leighton toward the door. "Get him out." I obeyed, half pulling the man into the street. The fog outside swirled with the sound, the whole air trembling. Holmes remained within, his silhouette flickering against the lantern's glow. Then, through the clamor, I heard him call Watson the circuit. I turned back to see him sprint toward the vestry, where the press and coil still lay. The foundryman cried out that the current had resumed. Holmes dropped to his knees beside the press, his fingers flying across the tangle of wires. Sparks leapt again, faint blue against the red haze of the lantern. Leighton, regaining strength, shouted that he had set a secondary relay, and the signal would continue until the bell itself split. Holmes looked up, and his voice carried through the tumult, precise and steady. "Then I shall let it split, but on my terms." He adjusted the coil, reversed the leads, and closed the circuit. The bell gave one final, staggering cry, a pitch so pure it seemed to erase every other sound. The glass of the church windows shivered and fell outward in a rain of shards. Then came silence, absolute and absolute only in contrast to what had come before. Holmes staggered into view, his coat scorched, his face pale but composed. The bell had ceased. Behind him, the tower stood intact, though scarred by fissures that ran like veins through the stone. He looked at me, breathing hard. "I changed its frequency, Watson. Instead of destruction, it released the stored resonance as a sigh rather than a scream." Leighton collapsed, sobbing. "You've silenced it forever." Holmes regarded him with quiet gravity. "No, only until it is earned again. Sound cannot be killed. It merely waits for a truer hand." The foundryman sank to his knees, murmuring that Merrick's ghost was at peace. Holmes shook his head. Ghosts are merely echoes of guilt. It is the living who make them speak. As the last dust settled, the church seemed to exhale, the timbers groaning like an old man waking from a nightmare. Holmes turned to me. "This night has rung too long. We shall see the police called before dawn to claim what remains." But even as he spoke, a faint resonance stirred once more, softer than breath, more suggestion than sound. Holmes stopped mid-sentence, his gaze lifting toward the darkened belfry. The bell, cracked yet unfallen, trembled ever so slightly. Then from within it came a low, unmistakable pulse, 2 measured beats, spaced like a heartbeat, and the silence afterward was alive with something unseen, waiting to answer. Holmes did not move. The faint pulse continued, deliberate and rhythmic, like the slow beat of an unseen heart buried high within the belfry. I felt the vibration in the floorboards beneath us, the echo of something that refused extinction. Holmes's eyes narrowed. 2 strikes, he said softly. A warning, not a repetition. Someone or something reactivated the mechanism from above. Leighton groaned where he knelt. "It isn't me, I swear it." Holmes's gaze remained fixed upward. "No, you lack the strength, and our foundryman lacks the knowledge, which leaves only the architect of this deception, the one who used both of you as instruments." The foundryman stammered that the last man of the old guild had died decades ago. Holmes's tone was grave. "Then tonight proves one survived, or one taught another to continue the craft." The next pulse came sharper, a short metallic cry followed by silence thick enough to press on the air. Holmes straightened abruptly. "Watson, the tower is being rewired even as we stand here." He seized the lantern and strode toward the stair. I followed, though the steps trembled with each beat of that unnatural rhythm. As we ascended, I saw that the fissures in the wall glowed faintly, the residue of heat from the reversed current Holmes had triggered. The air smelt of copper and burnt oil. He paused only once, fingers brushing the stone. Whoever works the circuit now does so manually. He must be above the bell itself. We reached the upper landing. The door to the belfry stood ajar, swaying gently as though stirred by breath. A dim light flickered beyond, the uncertain glow of a small lamp. Holmes raised a hand for silence, then stepped through. The bell loomed before us, its cracked surface trembling like a living thing. And there, standing atop the timber beam, was the silhouette of a man. He turned at the sound of our entrance. His coat was clerical black, his face smeared with soot, but the eyes were coldly lucid. Holmes addressed him without raising his voice. "You need not climb higher, Father. The sermon is over." The man smiled thinly. "You mistake me, Mr. Holmes. The sermon has only begun." He gestured toward the bell, and it shuddered as if to answer. Truth must ring until it is heard. Holmes stepped closer. Truth requires a listener, not an accomplice. You are no priest. You are the hand that struck the first deceit, the engraver of Merrick's false confession. The man inclined his head. "I engraved it, yes, for the guild that fed me, then betrayed me. They took the design, left me in prison, and the bell in silence. Tonight I will correct both." Holmes's expression remained calm, though his voice carried an edge. "You have killed to preserve your resentment. The actor, the accomplice below, perhaps others. And yet you claim to serve the truth." The man's hands tightened upon the rim of the bell. "They served lies for profit. I serve the sound that exposes them. This bell was cast to deceive the faithful, but it will die revealing the deceit. When it breaks, the city will hear what it was built to hide." Holmes said sharply, "You speak of memory in metal. What then lies within its tone?" The man's answer was almost a chant. The forged vows, the false relics, the names erased by clerics who feared discovery. Their signatures are imprinted in the alloy. When the bell cracks, the impurities will sing their confession." I whispered that such a notion was madness. Holmes replied quietly, "Perhaps, Watson, but madness is often merely logic stretched too thin." Holmes advanced another step. "You believe this sound will reveal your truth, but you misjudge physics as you misjudge faith. A cracked bell does not sing purity, it distorts it. Whatever your secret, it will die garbled in the noise you create." The man's voice rose. "Then let distortion be my testament." He reached for a small lever attached to the beam. Holmes darted forward, but too late the lever snapped downward, and the bell convulsed with a deafening clang. The air turned solid. I felt my vision blur as the vibration coursed through marrow and stone alike. Holmes staggered, shouting something lost in the roar. The beam above groaned. The bell swung once, twice, and then froze mid-motion, held by its own fractured weight. When the sound at last faltered, the man remained standing, arms outstretched, face lifted to the void above. "It is done," he murmured. Holmes, still braced against the wall, said through clenched teeth, "Indeed. You have sealed your confession in silence." A sharp crack echoed from above. The chain that suspended the bell began to tear free of the beam. Holmes leapt forward, seized the man's arm, and dragged him down just as the timber split. The bell dropped half a foot, wedged askew, its mouth yawning toward us like a wound. The clang that followed was hollow and finally a dying breath. Holmes pulled the man to the floor. "You are fortunate, sir," he said, breathing hard. "The truth you sought to release has no wish to be heard." The man's composure collapsed. "You cannot silence it forever," he whispered. "It will echo in the air, in the stone, in you." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Then let it echo in the record of your trial. That is where truths belong, not in tolling bells." He turned to me. "Watson, see Leighton. The police must have every witness before dawn." I nodded, but even as we prepared to leave, another sound caught Holmes's attention, faint, rhythmic, and unmistakable. 2 pulses again, softer this time, rising from somewhere beneath the tower rather than above. Holmes froze, the lantern trembling in his hand. So, the circuit was double-wired. The bell was but the mouthpiece, the heart still beats below. The man on the floor smiled weakly through the dust. "You see? Even in silence, it speaks." Holmes stared toward the stairway descending to the crypt. "Then we shall hear what it truly has to say." Holmes descended first, the lantern's flame shivering against the stone. The air below felt alive, as though the vibration itself breathed through the walls. Every few seconds came the faint double pulse, traveling upward through the steps beneath our feet, not metal this time, but a deeper, more organic thrum that suggested something built to resemble a heartbeat. Holmes spoke only once as we went down. "It is not sound alone that repeats, Watson, but intention. We shall soon meet the mind that conceived it." The passage opened again into the crypt where we had found the iron chest. It stood empty now, the chains scattered like dead snakes around its base. The source of the rhythm was clearer, not directly beneath the chest, but through the wall beyond it. Holmes placed the lantern on the floor and pressed his ear to the stones. "An enclosed cavity," he said. "The pulse you hear is mechanical, driven by pressure rather than electricity. Someone adapted the church's water pump to feed the current from the coil above." He pried loose one block with the point of his knife. A rush of warm air escaped, followed by the low hum of a concealed engine. We entered a narrow chamber lit by the dull red glow of a generator. Upon the floor stood a network of wires coiled about a copper cylinder the size of a coffin. Every few seconds the device shuddered, emitting that same double throb. Holmes bent over it, eyes keen. "So there lies our bell's heart, a resonator fashioned to sustain vibration long after the current ceases." I asked what purpose it could serve. He smiled faintly. the same as all hearts that refuse to stop beating to remind their creator he is not yet done with guilt. A figure shifted in the shadows behind the machine. The glow revealed the foundryman, his face gray with exhaustion, revolver still in hand. He started as we entered. "I thought you were gone," he said. Holmes stepped forward. "So did I, until I heard the bell answer from below. You knew of this mechanism." The man shook his head violently. "I swear I did not. I only built the housing as he ordered." Holmes's gaze softened. "Then tell me whose order?" The foundryman's eyes flickered toward the stair. It was the one they called Master Calvert, the last of the engravers. I never saw his face. He sent blueprints, paid in gold, and vanished. Holmes crouched beside the generator. "And yet his work remains. Do you not see, Watson? Each conspirator in this affair imagined himself the final author, Leighton with his false confession, the priest with his sermon, our would-be avenger above with his lever, but Calvert built the true conclusion. This device records vibration. It has been listening to us." I asked if that was possible. Holmes traced a wire leading from the cylinder into a cluster of glass tubes mounted on the far wall. Crude, but conceivable. Each tone produces an imprint of its frequency upon the filament. It could retain the sequence of every bell toll rung tonight. He turned to the foundryman. "When you said the metal remembers, you spoke truer than you knew." He leaned close to the tubes. Inside, faint sparks glimmered in time with the residual pulse. Then, very distinctly, the mechanism emitted a sequence of tones of 4 notes, soft but deliberate. Holmes stiffened. "That is Morse, Watson. Listen." The pulses repeated dot dash dot dot. Holmes whispered, "H." Again. Another group followed. O, then L, then M. He looked up. "It spells home." The final pulse came a long, single tone, then silence. I even felt the chill of it. Holmes, for the first time that night, seemed momentarily shaken. "Someone has used the machine to address me directly." He examined the controls. The message must have been set to trigger upon our entry. The true architect expected my presence. The foundryman muttered that no one could have predicted Holmes would come. "No one living," Holmes replied grimly. "But a clever enemy writes for the inevitable audience. Whoever designed this wanted to draw me here to hear this very sound." He reached for the switch. "We shall let him finish his sermon." The machine flared back to life, the red glow deepening until the walls quivered. The sequence began anew, more rapid now. Holmes decoded aloud as it played "The Bell Never Dies." It learned its listener. He snapped the lever down, cutting the current. The silence that followed was immense. Then he said, almost to himself, "We have not merely uncovered a crime, Watson. We have unearthed an idea built to survive its maker." The foundryman crossed himself again, whispering that the voice was cursed. Holmes rose. Not cursed, engineered. Calvert's final instrument was psychological, not divine. He meant the bell to outlive every confession, to adapt its resonance until it spoke to whoever sought to silence it. I remarked that it seemed to have succeeded. Holmes smiled thinly. "Indeed. And now it seeks a new listener." The generator shuddered once more, though the power had been cut. A faint echo repeated from the stair above was not electrical this time, but purely acoustic. 2 measured beats, then 2 more. Holmes straightened. "The resonance has moved. The tower above is amplifying what remains here." He turned sharply to the foundryman. "Where does this drain lead?" The man pointed toward a narrow arch beyond the engine. "It opens under the bell tower, near the base of the old cloister. Holmes seized the lantern. Then we go there at once. Whatever remains of this mechanism is completing its cycle." As we passed through the arch, the double pulse followed softer, almost mournful. Holmes paused only once, glancing back toward the dark chamber. "The message was meant for me, Watson." But I wonder whose voice will answer next. And with that, the pulse rose again, no longer 2 beats, but 3, a rhythm unmistakably human, echoing like footsteps through the hollow stone. The footsteps we had heard resolved into echoes of our own as we followed the narrow drain. Holmes's lantern cast long, shifting lines against the wet stone, and the pulse beneath our feet now seemed to match the cadence of our breathing. We moved in silence until the tunnel widened into a hollow space beneath the base of the tower, a cavity shaped like the inside of a bell itself. Holmes raised the light. The walls gleamed with faint metallic sheen, as though coated by dust of ground bronze. Along the far edge stood another device, smaller than the one above, but intricately built, a wheel of iron threaded with copper filaments, its spokes humming faintly with the same double pulse that had haunted us since the first toll. He crouched, eyes sharp. "There it is, Watson. The final chamber is the echo chamber, perhaps, of Calvert's design." I asked if it could be silenced. Holmes shook his head. To silence it would require knowing what sustains it. Observe how the pulse has no visible source. The current that feeds it is spiritual only to the guilty, physically to the engineer. A faint rasp answered from the shadows. The foundryman, who had followed, spoke with trembling awe. "It is alive, Mr. Holmes." Holmes regarded him evenly. "No, my good man is only awake." He moved closer to the device, tracing the copper strands that ran into the ground. They disappeared into a narrow fissure beneath the wall. These lines travel through the stone to the bell's foundation. Every vibration above was intended to reverberate here, where the machine would capture and repeat it indefinitely. He turned to me. "We stand inside the bell's memory." The words struck me with strange unease. The hum deepened, and for a moment I thought I heard more than mechanical rhythm, a faint modulation, almost speech, as though fragments of human voices were buried in the vibration. Holmes froze, listening. "Yes," he said. "Those are tones of language. Someone has encoded a message through the resonance." He adjusted one of the small metal plates affixed to the rim. The hum shifted into an articulate tremor guilt endures where faith is forged. The phrase repeated once, softer, then ceased. Holmes's face remained expressionless, though his eyes reflected the lantern light like flint. "Calvert's epitaph for his craft," he murmured. "He built a monument not to truth, but to endurance, the survival of deceit itself." The foundryman whispered, "Then it cannot be stopped." Holmes answered quietly. "Every echo fades if one ceases to answer it." He rose. "The current must be inverted. When a bell tolls, the clapper strikes inward to silence it. One must strike outward." He knelt again, reversed 2 of the copper leads, and twisted them against the damp stone. The hum faltered, then rose to a higher pitch that shimmered like breath drawn through glass. I felt the air thicken. "Now," he said, "when it next receives vibration from above, it will cancel its own tone." The floor shook, the tower reacting to the alteration above. Dust fell like ash. Holmes pressed his palm to the device. "It is working. The resonance is turning inward." But then, from the opening behind us, came a different sound, hurried footsteps, scraping against stone. Holmes spun, and the lantern lifted. Leighton staggered into the chamber, his coat torn, eyes wild with exhaustion. "You cannot stop it!" he cried. "He built it to survive destruction. When one frequency dies, another takes its place." Holmes seized him by the shoulders. "Leighton, listen to me. You are the last living echo of his guilt. Destroy this, and you destroy yourself, and perhaps that is what you desire. But if you value anything human, step back." Leighton's breath came ragged. "I only wanted his name redeemed." Holmes's voice softened. "Then redeem it by letting it end." Leighton hesitated, then lunged toward the wheel, wrenching at the copper filaments. The hum surged into a roar. Sparks showered. Holmes shouted for me to pull him away, but even as I moved, the air exploded with the sound of a wave so deep it felt like the earth itself had told. The light went out. For several seconds there was only darkness and the enormous dying vibration of metal giving way. Then came quiet, not silence, but the deep stillness that follows confession. I struck a match. The chamber lay in ruin. The wheel was shattered, its filaments severed. Leighton knelt beside it, breathing shallowly. Holmes crouched, felt his pulse, and nodded once. Alive, but spent. The hum was gone. Even the echo in the walls seemed to have fled. Holmes rose slowly, dusting his hands. It is finished. The sound that fed upon itself has devoured the last of its fuel. I asked if the bell above had survived. He listened. No tone returns, only stillness. The tower sleeps again. He looked toward the broken machine. Calvert's genius was never in what he built, but in what he believed that guilt could be made eternal. He was wrong. Leighton stirred. And Merrick? Holmes regarded him kindly. Merrick will rest as all men do in silence, not in sound. Then, almost to himself, he added, "Perhaps that is the true absolution." As we turned to leave, the lantern's flame flickered once, as if caught by a draught from some unseen passage. Holmes paused. "Do you hear it, Watson?" I listened, and faintly, somewhere deep beneath the foundation, came a single tone, low and pure. It lasted only a moment, then faded utterly. Holmes said very softly, "Even the dead must have their final note." We emerged into the ashen light before dawn. The fog had thinned to a pale veil, and St. Alban's bell tower loomed against the whitening sky, scarred but still standing. The city around us stirred faintly, oblivious to the long night's work. Holmes paused at the threshold, turning once to glance at the church doors now hanging unevenly from their hinges. His face was grey with fatigue, yet his expression carried the calm of a surgeon who had finally closed a wound. Behind us, the foundryman followed, guiding the weakened Leighton toward the waiting constable. Holmes murmured to the man, "See that he receives care, not condemnation. There is enough punishment in remembrance." The constable nodded, uncertain, but obeyed. When they were gone, Holmes stood in the street for a long moment without speaking. Only the faint hiss of the fog lamps filled the silence. I asked him if he believed the resonance was truly gone. He replied that sound, like sin, never disappears. It merely disperses until no ear can separate it from the air. What matters, he said, is not that we silence it, but that it no longer finds believers to echo it. We began to walk, our steps uneven upon the cobblestones. The dawn wind carried with it a scent of iron and damp stone. After several paces, he spoke again, more softly. "Do you know what deceived them all, Watson? Not greed, nor faith, but the wish that guilt might be redeemed by spectacle. They wanted to see a repentance ring like a bell, visible, audible, theatrical. But redemption is quieter than that." I said that his reasoning tonight had bordered on faith itself. He smiled faintly. A detective's creed differs little from a priest's, save that we demand proof before absolution. We turned the corner. The tower was no longer visible, but its shadow seemed to cling to the fog behind us. I told him that Calvert's invention had been both ingenious and terrible, a machine designed to preserve deceit through sound. Holmes nodded. An apt metaphor for human memory. We record what we cannot forgive and replay it until the truth becomes distorted. Calvert merely gave the weakness a mechanism. The wind shifted, carrying the city's first morning sounds of a wagon, a bell from a milk cart, distant voices. Each note felt startlingly alive after the hollow tones of the night. Holmes stopped again and listened. "There, Watson. That is how truth endures, not in the tolling of monuments, but in the everyday clatter of those who rise to begin again. I could not help but glance back once more toward the tower's silhouette. The silence there was immense, yet not empty. I said that I imagined the bell still trembling, slightly in its sleep. He replied, "Let it dream. Even bronze deserves rest." We crossed into the quieter lanes near Holborn. The gaslights paled against the spreading dawn. Holmes walked with hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders drawn but steady. I ventured a final question whether he thought the name of Father Merrick would ever be cleared. He said, "History will remember what it chooses, as it always does." But I prefer to think that, somewhere in the city's memory, the note of his innocence will continue to vibrate inaudibly, yet persistent. And that is enough. We reached Baker Street as the first sun reached the upper windows. Mrs. Hudson's curtains twitched, startled perhaps by our ghostly return. Holmes entered ahead of me, removed his coat, and placed the violin upon the table. For a long while he said nothing, merely tuning a single string D sharp, faintly flat, the same tone that had haunted us since midnight. He played one soft note, and its echo lingered through the room. "There, Watson," he murmured. "The same frequency. Yet do you feel the difference?" I admitted I did not. He smiled, eyes half closed. "This one begins and ends in peace. The other began in pride and ended in ruin." He set down the bow. "We spend our lives tracing echoes of crimes, of motives, of hearts that once rang true. And perhaps that is all detective work, is listening for false notes and returning them to silence." I asked if he would sleep. "Soon," he said. "But before that, we must write the report. Kramer will wish to know whether the bell can be salvaged." I laughed despite myself, saying that I doubted any inspector would comprehend the half of it. "Nor should he," Holmes replied. "If every man heard what we heard tonight, the city would never sleep again." He moved to the window. Outside, the morning sun caught the wet pavements, turning them to liquid silver. From somewhere far away, another church bell sounded the hour clear, unbroken and profoundly ordinary. Holmes listened until it faded. "You see," he said quietly, "there is always another bell waiting to take the burden." The moment held, then passed. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable, and added almost gently, "The city must keep ringing, Watson, or men like Calvert would think silence their right to command." He reached for the violin once more, tested the string, and smiled faintly. "The tone is restored. Let us leave it so." And as the note dissolved into the morning, I thought of that ruined tower not as a monument of deceit, but as a lesson in the endurance of truth, that even in collapse, something within the sound remains pure. It seemed to me then that Holmes himself was part of that echo, tireless, unflinching, listening always for the note that others miss. When the final vibration died, the room held perfect stillness. Holmes closed the violin case, exhaled, and said only, "At last, the bell is silent." And in that silence, London began again.